Thank you. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk today a little bit about the University of Victoria Library's uh, Historic Computing Lab. I am presenting today from the University of Victoria Libraries on the territory of the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Quisapsum Esquimalt peoples. And I would like to note that I very much acknowledge with respect and gratitude the Lekwungen and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue on into the present day. Um, so, University of Victoria Library's Historic Computing Lab, a photo of which you see before you, um, is a facility that's been in development since roughly 2016 or so. Um, what I would like to do today is to sort of start off giving you a little bit of just a tour of the lab virtually. So if you were to visit the lower level of the um, main library here at the University of Victoria and into the sort of little obscure space next to the compact shelving where the lab is kept. What you would actually see if you were in the rooms, I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of equipment that we've been collecting over the years and some where it's come from. I think I have a little segue into Canadian computing because we do have a bit of a focus on collecting Canadian computing equipment. Would like to do more of that, and then talk a little bit about what are some of the projects and work that the lab has supported over the years, some of the events and things that we've been involved in, and then finally wind up with a little bit of a talk about what the future of the lab is going to be or projected things that are sort of near term and a little bit more medium term projects that the lab could be involved in. So hope that it meets with everybody's sort of expectations as to what you might want to see in a session like this. So we'll just get launched right into the tour part, I think, as we so if you were to come into the front door of the library into this windowless room in the basement, you would be greeted with a room full of computers, largely from the the earliest computer in the collection is from the 1960s. We don't have very much of that. We start most of the collection starts kind of in the mid 1970s, and then we have an awful lot of equipment from about the 1980s through the mid 1990s, and then the collection kind of cuts off. We kind of had to draw a line somewhere, so it kind of cuts off at around the year 2000 or so. And the rationale for that is that um, we ran out of room, basically. There's only so much stuff you can collect. The original rationale, I think, was something along the lines of that we were kind of more focused on what I would call the Precambrian era of computing technology, where there's quite a bit of different differentiation in the kinds of hardware that was being manufactured at the time. That people hadn't kind of settled on a standard, more of a kind of standard set of technologies. Um, Certainly by the time you get into the 2000s, you at least desktop computing is really settled on, Intel processors and a couple of different operating systems, but everything's kind of interoperable now in a way that it never ever was back in the early 80s. I think we're starting to see a little bit more differentiation, and of course there's whole realms of computing that this collection does not cover, like mobile computing, for example, VR stuff. I mean, there's just a whole range of equipment that, arguably one should be collecting and isn't. We also don't have much in the way of game consoles, although that's something that would probably be of use as well. What we do have, however, as I'll be describing as we move through the slides, so right on this slide you can see we have a lot of Commodore equipment. First thing as you see as you come in through the door, the Commodore Amiga, Commodore 64, VIC-20, Commodore PET. Um, uh, Followed by a table full of Apple equipment. So you can also see the sort of a big Mac workstation down at the end here. The iMac G3. I believe this was actually one of the original computers that was in the library when I first got here. We were using them as kind of quick lookup stations at the time. So we do have a couple or three of those in the collection. I should mention also that most of the equipment, well, pretty much all of it works to some level of what we would call working. So, but so. So wanted to turn them on and use them to run programs, one definitely could do that. There's an Apple IIe and then an Apple IIc next to it. You also see on the table some documentation. We do collect software and documentation, but I will say we don't do a great job of collecting software and documentation in that that's very much a work in progress in terms of cataloging it and um, kind of identifying, just organizing it in general. Um, it's a huge job, and the lab is not super well resourced, I guess you could say, in terms of person power. And I can talk a little bit more about that as we move through the tour. But we do definitely have documentation. We do have software, and can usually find it if we need it for a particular using a particular workstation or for a particular project. We have an awful lot of compact Macs in the collection. Much of the collection came to us by way of donation, and it seems that lots of folks just kind of held onto their compact Macs, maybe because they're easy to store. So we have a full range, except for the very, very first compact Mac that was created in 1984, but we have the successor model and everything up to the end of the Color Classic line in the early 1990s. And a number of these workstations have been networked together on an Apple Talk network, which makes it much easier to both transfer files to these computers when, say, we need to use them in an exhibition. It also makes it easier to transfer files off of these computers because we can transfer the files across a network to a more modern Mac that has a thing like maybe we'll take a USB-A device that we can then transfer the files to more modern storage. So that's been quite a useful feature of the lab in this regard. We do have some PCs as well. The lab, this really just a hall of shame photo. It's kind of, you can see kind of just a bunch of mess back there, but uh, we'll get that cleaned up one day. So we do have a number of PCs. Sort of the kind of more recent Dell 1990s PC, a PS2 from the late 80s, which was kind of IBM's last ditch attempt to make the PC technology more proprietary again, after all the clones came out in the early part of the 80s. And then PC XT, I think this one's a 286, so it does have a hard drive. Um, and across the aisle, then we've got more, I would say, somewhat institutional computing. So this big thing on the floor here is what's called a micro PDP-11. So the PDP-11 line was a line of computers from Digital Equipment Corporation that was manufactured, I think, going back into the early 1970s. The original models of the PDP-11 were basically the size of refrigerators and beyond. But by the time you get to the later models of the PDP-11, you get it down to this sort of micro level, which only takes two people to lift it. So it's very compact as far as that technology goes, and it communicates with one of these serial terminals. It's doesn't have a monitor in the way that we normally think of a monitor. It's just sort of a text-based interface. This is a little bit more of a broad view of that particular section of the lab. Um, you can see we have a Next machine here. That was the original machine on which, say, Tim Berners-Lee developed the World Wide Web. Not this actual machine, but the model of the machine that we have. It was a popular. The Next was a company that Steve Jobs created after Apple booted him out the first time back in the mid 1980s. He created Pixar. He created Next. Pixar was quite successful. Next was not so much. And But it did have a market in the universities, particularly at the time. It was a commodity Unix workstation, and back in the day when that was kind of a novel thing, and quite popular on campuses around the world. We actually had a Next distribution point in our engineering department back in the late 80s and early 1990s, and we And then, this one actually came from, I think, originally from Fine Arts, but we did subsequently receive two or three more of them from our engineering department when the engineering department cleared out an old storage locker when they were doing some departmental renovations. Um, so just to highlight that a lot of this equipment, well, we'll get to where it came from in a minute, but a lot of it came from can, donations from various campus departments on campus. Anyway, it's amazing what the university had kind of held on to in various departmental storage rooms over the years. What's next to it is an SGI Onyx workstation. So this was a high-end graphics workstation. It would have cost something like $300,000 when it was new. It was used for things like doing, again, the model of computer, not this particular one, was used for things like doing computer graphics for Hollywood movies, things like that. This particular computer belonged to Boeing, I believe, and was used to design airplanes at one time. I will say it runs Doom very, very well. But it's also kind of a terrifying process to boot it up, so I don't turn it on very often. And the one next to it is another PC. I believe it's the AT, if I'm not mistaken. What's different about this one is it's running the Microsoft's original Unix operating system. It was called Xenix. So Microsoft actually did a version of Unix back in the 1980s and I think into the early 90s. And This one was actually running a development version of that software that was given to us by one of the original developers of the Xenix system. So Canadian computing, I mentioned we do have a small collection of specifically Canadian computing hardware. To say I would like to expand that if we can, but um, uh, we're constrained as to kind of what's available here. So I'll give you some examples of what we have in the collection. This is it's called a Pied Piper. So it's a kind of semi-portable computer, I guess. It was an interesting industrial design. So the computer is actually just this one piece um, beige box here with a built-in floppy drive, and pretty much entirely the entire computer part is just a very slightly larger than a full-size keyboard. But you also would need to bring a monitor with you because it didn't have that kind of thing built into it. So that would limit its portability, I would think. And also, of course, it doesn't run off of a battery; it runs off of the mains. Um, as well. I guess as a digression here, we do have a fairly large selection of luggable computers which I didn't actually include as part of the tour. So these would be essentially sewing machine size computers that would just barely fit under an airplane seat, and would be were what was passed for portable computing back in the sort of in the 1980s, the kind of mid 1980s era as well. We've got quite a few different models of portable, of luggable computer. Again, largely because I think they were easy for people to just kind of pack away and forget about. So they survived longer than a lot of sort of more elaborate commodity PCs. Back to the topic of Canadian computing, we do have uh, a Nabu network computer. This was kind of an really interesting device. Um, so back in the early 1980s, sort of 82, 83, there was a company in Ottawa, um, the Nabu Corporation, that came up with an idea for essentially a cloud-based computer before there was a cloud, essentially. So a computer where all of the programs were actually hosted by your cable company. And it had a dedicated connection to your cable network. And it would actually, you could download your productivity software, your games, all of this. Just every time you connected to the computer, you turned on the computer, it would connect to the your cable company, and you could just page through a menu of choices to download whatever program you wanted to run at that particular moment in time. Um, I believe they did actually come with some local storage. So if you were, say, working on a word processing document, you could save a local copy of that. But for the most part, it was these were all run off of a centralized information service. It was a cool idea, but never really got off the ground commercially. So it only lasted a couple of years before it failed in the marketplace. And of course, became very, very obscure after that until back in the late, well, it was around the early 2020s, I guess. Um, it was discovered that there was kind of a technology hoarder, I guess you could say, who'd stored about 2,000 of these things in a barn in the States, somewhere. And the barn was starting to collapse under the weight of 2,000 of these devices. And so they suddenly appeared on eBay for a period of a couple of years as this fellow just was unloading them for not very much money, really. So suddenly out in the world, there were all of these Naboo devices, just kind of sitting there. But there was no online service that they could connect to in order to download the software that they needed to run. So what do you do? Well, of course, you have a community of retro computing enthusiasts who are just really, really eager to go out there and fill that void. Plus, you have a member, an employee of the original Naboo company who happened to keep all the software just, just in case. So right now out on the internet, there actually is a service that you can connect to that will download all of your Naboo software for you, or you can download Naboo software from. And so what you can see in this photo is that our Naboo device is connected to a more modern laptop that's essentially acting as an internet adapter for the Naboo computer and allows us to actually run the thing as a functional device in the show. Prior to all of this, the only place you could have seen a functional Naboo computer was in the York University Computing Museum. They'd actually done a big project to reconstruct the Naboo. But after this kind of trove of Naboo computers was discovered, um, it's basically kind of ubiquitous now. There's even Naboo adapters you can install on a modern computer that will pretty much do the same thing as the original hardware did. Extended digression into Naboo. This was an interesting one. This is a homebrew luggable computer. It was made by engineers at Microtel, which is a subsidiary of the BC Tel company. Tiny little text on the screen. I don't know how anybody did anything useful with this, but for a homebrew computer, it's actually pretty cool and pretty professionally made. The fact that it, runs 45 years after it was made. There's some question of whether this actually predates commercial luggable computers or not. It's pretty close. So there's maybe some historical significance to this, or maybe not so much, depending on exactly when it was created. Unfortunately, it's not easy to find out information about some of these things. Um, The lab has been involved over the years. It's sort of our flagship project actually was in the reconstruction of a whole sort of lost school of Canadian digital art that was made out of a very, very Canadian technology called Teledon. That's a whole different presentation, which I have given a whole given a lot of time. So I'm not going to actually go into any more or much more detail here. But just to suffice it to say that Teledon was an interesting parallel technology to Naboo in a way. It was another Canadian, very Canadian designed and developed online system that was basically built to deliver content to consumers over the networks that existed at the time, and it was also an abject failure in the marketplace, just like Naboo was. But we do have some original Teledon equipment in the collection, which we've used in the context of our project to restore and recover Teledon graphics and Teledon art. Um, and this is another example of a Teledon device that was actually this one was found, the previous one was found in the collection of the Spark Radio Museum in Coquitlam It kind of happened, kind of, well, we bought it from them essentially for our collection. And the this one was found in a storage room in our computer science building. A lot of equipment was found in this particular storage area in our computer science building. What happened was a technician who had worked in the department for decades, retired, and his successor decided that they really didn't need to keep this equipment around anymore. Um, uh, I was invited to evaluate what was there, and we acquired a number of really interesting devices as part of that haul that we took away from the comp sci. But one of them was this prototype electrohome decoder that would have been used by one of our faculty members back in the early 80s who was working on the Telenon project at the time. So very nice to have, and this one appears to work as well. Um, I wanted to talk a little bit about the origins of the lab. I'm just conscious of the time here, so we'll move along. Um, I never had had any intention of doing this when this started 10 years ago. I was doing I was on a research leave looking at how we would make accessible some of the digital media and materials that we collected in the university archives over the years. And as part of that research project, I was looking primarily at emulation as a strategy for accessing these artifacts, and I put on a small display in the library in association with a thing we used to do called Idea Fest, which is kind of an open house here, just where I scrounged up some old computers and then I put emulated versions of the on modern computers kind of next to the older computers so that people could actually see, okay, here's an emulated version of a Mac OS 9 operating system, and here's a Mac OS period Mac running the OS 9 operating system. Compare and contrast, sort of just out of kind of interest. How does emulation change something? How is it the same? How is it different? Anyway, word got out around campus that there's this guy in the library who's interested in old computing hardware, and got a call from our surplus coordinator. A few weeks later saying, well, if you like old computers, we've got a whole bunch in our surplus warehouse that I've just kind of been sitting on. And at that point, I was like, well, I don't know, am I interested in old computers or not? Um, but we kind of gave it some thought and thought, well, okay, we'll have a look at the stuff and see if there's any use that we can make of it. And it turned out that there was definitely some interest in the library. I will say that this lab has been quite well supported by our university librarian since its inception. So was not discouraged from using some of the space in the library to at least start collecting these um, devices and just kind of on a kind of speculative basis to see what kind of use we could make of them. Um, uh, that original find, as I mentioned, was augmented by finds all the way around, all across the library. This is a telarray terminal that dates from 1976 that was in a disused observatory at the top of the Elliott building. Just almost developed back problems getting it out of there, but occupational hazard. Lots of community donations. Word got around the community that we were interested in this. This is our star donor, Rob Ferguson. Um, Used to work for Microsoft. He's the one who gave us the SGI Onyx machine and a whole bunch of other stuff. Really great guy, very helpful, and also very handy. So that when he donates equipment to us, he's made sure to actually refurbish it to the point where it works. So very grateful to Rob for all the help that he's given us over the years. Um, some of the questions around, so once you have the equipment, then the question is kind of what do you do with it? And I will say at the outset, um, this equipment has not been used as a lab, really. Like we don't sort of have a big class of students come into the lab, sit down at the computers and do what with them exactly, right? Each computer is different. Each one, it works in ways that or many of them work in ways that are completely non-intuitive, and you'd have to actually read the manual to figure out how to do anything useful with them at all. So as a lab, not so much. But for other practical purposes, I think it has been quite useful. One of the things obviously goes back to the origins of the lab, recovering data for the university archives. So we do a lot of that. I have a colleague, Greg Lanning, who is very, very adept at figuring out old data formats and working with very old devices and readers to get this going. Obviously, we have a number of special purpose devices for this. This is a workstation that was built for the purpose, but we also have things like cryofluxes and grease weasels and all the usual kit that you need to get the data off of various devices. Lots of optical disk readers as well. It's got lots of content on those media, and that seems to be a never-ending project for Greg. So that just keeps rolling in. We've had a visiting researcher actually quite recently. Mimi Lam from UBC came and worked with us for a week to look at some data from the UBC archives, which was really cool. It was great having Mimi here, and I think she thought it was a valuable way to spend a week. So that was kind of awesome. We put a number of workshops over the years. So a lot of the our workshops were done in conjunction with the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, which unfortunately is no longer at UVic anymore. But it was great while it lasted. I was working a lot with Dini Grigar, who's she's from Washington State University. She's got an amazing collection of electronic literature, and so we sort of co-taught or I like to think of it me supporting her giving a course, but I did some instruction at DHSI 2019, and then we did some virtual events during that period where we weren't meeting in person. Our last collaboration was an exhibition that she had put together with which included some artifacts from the historic computing collection as well. Hypertext and Art was in 2024, and that ran during DHSI for a week here in the library. Um, as part of the Teledon Recovery Project, we participated in an exhibition in Toronto in 2023, thing called Remember Tomorrow. Yeah, that was quite a well-attended event. We worked with them to present yes Teledon devices on in a gallery scenario. That said, we couldn't use the original hardware, so basically we built kind of reproductions of Teledon equipment using relatively modern computers that were hidden behind the plinths, and then some professional video monitors to give that CRT experience, which I have to say really did pretty much perfectly replicate the experience of actually looking at Teledon on the original Teledon devices. So I was quite pleased with how that turned out. We've done some significant restoration work. Worked with a um, technician, or he's retired now, but he does work for us from time to time. Fellow with some pretty amazing electrical engineering chops who managed to restore like an early Altair computer. So this was one of the original home computers, probably what was called the first commercially successful home computer that came out in about 1975. And we had a couple donated to the lab that were in really terrible shape, like just bad. He reconstructed them both with uh, technologies that would have been available at the time. We couldn't restore them exactly the way they would have been coming from the factory. And we didn't actually want to because as they came from the factory, they were almost useless. But he did restore them in the way that they could have been reconfigured by someone who was working back in the 1970s. There's some really interesting questions around this in terms of ships of Theseus problems when you're keeping old computers going, right? Questions of authenticity and so forth. So, does it matter that we have a different power supply in this one than would have been in the original? It's kind of, it could have been. Anyway, leave that to the philosophers for the moment. We won't go more deeply into that question at this time. We do have some exhibits in the library periodically as well. This was that same computer that I showed you before on display with some supporting cultural materials beside it in the library last fall. We support various open houses and launch events. This was the launch event for the Kula Library Futures Academy, which is the parent organization for the Historic Computing Lab within the library, and provides hopefully, some operational and administrative continuity for it, should I ever be, you know, able to retire. Won't be happening soon. Hopefully, but yeah, no, there's some question around the sustainability of the lab because basically most of it is just me kind of doing stuff, but we'll see how it goes. Um, Weird little fun project. We have a book arts lab as well with a lot of original sort of printing presses in it. And Just looking at the time here. How much do I want to describe this project? Basically, it was we had some blocks given to us with the specifications for a computing language called APL. These blocks were actually belonged to the creator of APL, the language who used to work for IBM and was a Canadian computer scientist. Um, and he used these as business sort of calling cards, I guess, or business cards. So we worked with our book arts lab. Uh, these came our way as a loan from Rob Ferguson, the collector I mentioned before, and we used our book arts lab to actually print up more copies of the APL specification on these tiny little business card um, uh, size pieces of card. Anyway, it was a fun project. I've distributed some of them to our collaborators at other cognate organizations, and the collector, of course, has a few himself now. Um, just very briefly go over some of the plans for the future of the lab. So we're sponsoring a Plan 9 workshop here at UVic. This was actually organized by our engineering department, but we volunteered to sponsor it to make some connections between the lab and engineering, hopefully, and also because Plan 9 has some really interesting historical implications in the development of computing. It was developed by the originators of the Unix operating system to be a successor to Unix. That never happened, but it still embodies some really interesting ideas around operating system design, and there's still groups of people who are kind of hacking on it and developing it as kind of an educational and hobby project. So that seemed appropriate for the lab to kind of get involved in that. There's a Teledon art documentary that's going to be we're filming filming in the lab in the middle of May. So we'll, at some point, presumably the lab will be immortalized in a documentary about the recovery and development of the Teledon art project. We've also got a new space, so that windowless room in the basement of the library with all the low ceilings, which is kind of appropriate to the collection. We're actually moving to a much nicer space on the second floor of the main library. Not looking forward to moving all that gear, but because we can't really entrust it to movers. It's pretty fragile and kind of goes together funny. So I expect I'm going to do a lot myself, and got a few volunteers in the library to do it. But yeah, it's something to consider if you ever want to start one of these facilities. Is like try to put it in a place where you're never going to have to move it. Still, it's going to be a very nice space once we actually get into the new part of it. And then a couple of things that are just sort of maybes at this point. We're participating in two SSHRC grant applications. There's a thing called the Future of Digital Media Art Histories that's a SSHRC partnership grant coming out of Queen's University, and that we're supporting, and another grant that's coming out of York University, partnership development grant to create something called the Canadian Computing Heritage Network, which would be essentially a way or a set of events and projects and communication vehicles for cognate facilities across Canada to kind of share expertise and work on projects relating to the history of Canadian computing. So that involves collaborators like, well, obviously York University, who's originating it, University of Saskatchewan, um, University of Quebec Montreal, Library Archives Canada, and Genium Museum are all applicants on that grant. So hoping that one comes through, and if it does, then we've got our work cut out for us starting in the fall, I would assume. So um, maybe have a few minutes for questions, or let me know. Um, Now, I'll stop sharing the screen at this point.